I will begin by asking each of the experts to offer a few opening comments to kick off the conversation. We will then open it up to the floor for an interactive session of question and answers. And I will reserve the final 5 minutes of this session for the panelists to have an opportunity to provide any closing thoughts. But before I do so, let me briefly introduce the panelists. Our first speaker will be Shanti Kalathio. Shanti is Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. She is also a leading expert in developing the concept of sharp power. Our second speaker will be Professor David Shambaugh. David is the Gaston Seeger Professor of Asia Studies and the founding director of the China Policy Program in the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He is also one of the most active public intellectuals on China of our time. He has published more than 30 books and is a regular commentator on China and on U.S. China relations. Our third speaker will be Professor Frank Wu. Frank is a distinguished professor at the University of California Hastings College of Law, where he previously served as chancellor and dean. Frank is also president of the Committee of 100, a prominent Chinese-American leadership organization. Further details on each of their biographies, which are much more distinguished than what I've presented to you, are in the brochures that you have. So with that, Shanti, please take it away.
Is it okay if I stay seated here?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you so much to Brookings for hosting what is a really crucial and important conversation to have. I should note at the outset that although the frame is U.S. China relations, I will probably not address my remarks to that specifically and couch my remarks more in the context of the significance to democracies overall, because I think that many of the issues that we're talking about are of significance to democracies around the world, and we are starting to see some of the same issues play out around the world, particularly in established democracies like Australia, New Zealand, Germany, and so on. I should also note at the outset, since you've mentioned this in your remarks, and I would like to emphasize this, that when I speak about China, sometimes I will say China as shorthand. I really mean to refer to the activities of the Chinese government and the party, and not the Chinese people. And I think it's important to draw that distinction in these types of remarks, because I'm very conscious of not wanting any of these remarks or the discussion to shade over into xenophobia or racism, which is something I think none of us in discussing this issue would want. So that's why I try to be careful and precise in framing that. And when I say Beijing, that's what I mean to refer to there. I thought it'll be hard to go into the full breadth of some of the work that my program has done around these issues, but I thought I would start just by couching it in terms of my own experience doing some research on Chinese internet censorship and the way that the Chinese internet unfolded within China. This was started in the year 2000, actually a couple doors down at the Carnegie Endowment. And at the time, I was just curious because I had spent some time as a reporter in Hong Kong covering how the internet was rolling out through Asia, how it was starting to penetrate in Hong Kong and China. And at the time, there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm about how openness and the internet as representative of sort of open engagement and open societies would ultimately transform more authoritarian societies. And so my co-author and I looked at several authoritarian countries to determine whether or not these types of predictions would in fact be borne out. And in our research, what we found is that actually authoritarian governments seem to actually have a handle on how to largely control the political impact of the internet within their borders. And I focused on China in particular, and I found my conclusions to actually go against the grain of what most people assumed at the time. So when we came out with our book, it was not really that popular. And a lot of people said, you know, you guys are being so pessimistic, and you know, the Chinese government will never manage to contain the popular impact of this technology. So that was the reaction at that time. And since then, as things have evolved, I've continued to keep an eye on this issue with great interest. And it is not surprising to me, nor is it of comfort to me, that I find that, in fact, the Chinese government has managed to control the political impact of the internet. And to a large extent, if we are to use this as a metaphor for the type of engagement with open societies that we've been discussing, it has largely managed to control that as well. What I have found surprising in recent years is the extent to which this concept that was introduced originally as sort of the Great Firewall, right? You know, the Chinese censorship system of the internet, from the Chinese government's viewpoint, has essentially been rolled out to have a more global frame. In essence, that those types of techniques to try to manage and control political thought and speech that have worked well within China are now being tested outside of China as well, and in particular, actually in democracies, whether in the U.S., Australia, and other places, as well as in the vulnerable democracies that we studied in the Sharp Power report. And this takes place through a number of ways, both through the technology itself and through a more active and engaged Chinese government presence in the very forms that will shape how the internet unfolds. So China has been very active in trying to affect internet governance forums, for instance, to push its concept of what it calls cyber sovereignty in places where that essentially will affect how the internet will look, not now, but in the future. And this, of course, would have great ramifications for speech in the future and the potential for political communication around the world in the future. It's also sought to do so in a more granular sense, though, in trying to shape the environments in which discourse about China takes place. And you may be familiar with some of these recent instances in which pressure has been exerted on academic publishers, for instance, to censor journals that are published within China. And this has happened in a couple of cases with academic publishers, and perhaps alarmingly, was only really noted after it became public in the case of Cambridge University Press, and there was a widespread outcry, and they were forced to walk that back. But without that attention to that issue, I'm not sure that would have gone noticed. I know we're running out of time here, and so I won't go into a long list of examples, but I found what Congressman Larson said to be quite striking. I'm not a football fan, so I don't know what a defensive coordinator is, but I think that the metaphor about offense really rang true to me. Not that I think that the U.S. and other democracies should be offensive in their approach, but simply that they should safeguard democratic values at home. There is nothing wrong, and indeed it is incumbent upon democracies to understand what those values are and to ensure that if freedom of speech and association and expression is threatened at home, that democratic values are brought to bear and democratic institutions are shored up so that those values can be protected. This is not about telling another country what to do per se. It really, the focus here is on democracies themselves and how they can best hew to their own values in standing up for freedom of speech and association. And the second thing that Congressman Larson said that stuck with me was when he was talking about the human rights and freedom of expression and general civil society condition within China now, he said, you know, I'm free to critique that and to express my opinion, and when I'm done, I can get up and I can walk out of here. And unfortunately, for a number of particularly whether they are Chinese students studying abroad or others who may feel pressured by the Chinese government for various interests, that ability is not there within democracies as much anymore. Not everybody can stand up in a democracy and walk out of the room after making a statement about the situation within China and feel similarly protected. And that, to me, is unacceptable in a democracy. I think in a democracy, you should be able to express yourself. You should be able to clearly analyze the situation, and to go back to the comments made by at the beginning of the session, there have been calls to apply a clear-headed and analytical approach towards the Chinese government. If the means of expression and the means we have to understand the Chinese government are constrained by the Chinese government themselves, it will be impossible to have that clear-eyed assessment. And so ultimately it goes back to that and to reaffirming our own democratic values. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Shanti. Now, Professor Shambaugh.
Well, this is a hugely, well, thank you, Ryan, first of all, and to Chung and to Brookings for organizing today's session and including me in it. It's a pleasure to be back at Brookings. This is a hugely complicated topic, and unlike Shanti, who spoke extemporaneously, I've tried to organize some of my thoughts not least because there are a number of journalists in the audience. I want to make sure what I say is caught correctly. This is a huge topic, and time is not great, so let me just try and offer some distinctions, I think, that we need to be cognizant of as we think about this topic. First of all, we've had the concept of soft power in our vocabulary now ever since Joseph Nye's book appeared. More recently, we have, thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy, the concept of sharp power. I personally am still trying to wrap my brain around this term and that concept, and whether it applies to China, with a question mark. I guess my sense is that it does not apply yet to China. What I see China doing is more what I would call public diplomacy with Chinese characteristics, or journalism with Chinese characteristics. And thirdly, what the term the Chinese use for this is very important. We have to understand China the way they define themselves. The term they use is 对外宣传工作, external propaganda work, 对外宣传工作, or they translate 宣传 as publicity, but it's really propaganda. So that's one distinction. Another distinction, China is very different from Russia and what we see Russia doing. Sharp power and other harsher terms very much apply to Russia. Russia, it seems to me, is really trying to subvert American and Western institutions, democracy, and values. China, I don't see trying to do that. For China, it's all about China, controlling, as Shanxi just said, the international narrative on China. That is their bottom line, and that's their goal. They have concluded back in 2007 at the 17th Party Congress, when Hu Jintao gave his speech and first used the term Ran Shili, soft power, in his speech, that was the result of an assessment that the Chinese had made that image matters in international relations, and that their image wasn't particularly good, and they needed to start paying attention to it. So from 2007 and the 17th Congress on to the present, they have been pouring huge resources into a whole range of activities towards what end? To affect the international narrative on China. That's what they're after, as far as I can understand. So it's not really soft power, and it's not really sharp power. It's kind of public diplomacy, and with Chinese characteristics. And they have a huge bureaucracy, huge budgets devoted to it. And there are many targets outside of China. Who are these targets? Well, in this country, the U.S. media. And their own media. There are a number of people in this room representing the Chinese media. They are part of this influence activities, if you will. Another target, overseas Chinese and Chinese Americans. Academics, think tanks, universities, the Brookings Institution, the Carnegie Endowment, Johns Hopkins, Peterson Institute. You know, we are targets of these activities. They try and affect how we think about China, how we write about China. Whether they have an impact on that's another question, but I'm just saying we are the sort of the target. Third, targets national, state, and local politicians. Whether you're in the Congress, or you're in the state government, you're in a municipal government, or you're in the White House, or the executive branch. Fourth target, the public at large. And finally, as Frank will talk about, Chinese Americans. So this is a very organized, sophisticated, well-resourced operation. We can talk about more if you're interested in who the actors are. So that's a distinction. There's another distinction I think is very important between exchanges and influence activities. I would argue that all exchanges are, in fact, influence activities, attempted influence activities. We do it, they do it, Britain does it, every country does it. If you go into an exchange, you're not just neutrally going into the room to have an exchange of views, you're trying to get the other side to see your view, right? So we bring Chinese to this country and people from all over the world under various exchange programs. They bring Americans to China and from all over the world under various exchange programs. What's the goal? To get them to understand, the foreigner, to understand China's perspective and hopefully have sort of positive feelings about China when they go back to their home country. Exchanges are good, and it's really up, at the end of the day, it's up to those foreigners who are targets of China's influence activities to make up their own minds. be independent. You can resist being propagandized. You can resist being co-opted into China's narratives. You don't have to use China's narratives and language and口号, slogans. So just because the Chinese invest a lot in these activities doesn't in fact mean that they're successful. If you look at public opinion polls around the world, China's image continues to be mixed. Better in some parts of the world, worse in other parts of the world. Now, just to conclude my own thoughts on this. So there's no real evidence that the Chinese in this country are doing what the Russians are doing, or in any country. Nor is there any evidence yet that I can see that what they're doing in this country follows on what they've done in Australia and Europe, based on the reports and the evidence we have from Merrick's in Berlin on the Europe case and a lot of media reporting in Australia. I've looked at those cases very carefully. I do not see those things happening yet. Maybe it will, but not yet. So it's potential. It's not here and real in the United States. Nonetheless, there are concerns, and Shanti, I think, has just listed a number of those. I'd like to finish on the same note she did and Congressman Larson did. Chinese studies and the understanding of China. This is what really concerns me. The real threat is how China is studied around the world. There are whole areas of China, Xinjiang, Tibet, Gansu, Qinghai, Ningxia, for example, that are off limits, physically off limits to foreign scholars. Their archives are closed and off limits. There is not a single ministerial archive in the Chinese government open to foreign scholars. Foreign Ministry Archive used to be open, now it's closed. Number 2 archives, Nationalist Archives in Nanjing, closed. Military archives, closed. Party archives, closed. Many libraries, closed. Opportunities to interview officials at many levels of government in China, restricted. And just being a resident scholar, visiting scholar in Chinese research institutions, highly constricted. There is such a lack of reciprocity in the scholarly exchange domain between the U.S. and China that if you want to get a new China policy, I think we have to add that to the mix. And I agree with Congressman Larson that the United States government and Congress needs to have a strategy and allocate substantial funding. If we're worried about Chinese money or Hong Kong money coming into our institutions that might affect our research agenda, well, then the United States has got to fund Chinese studies and other countries' studies. So I'm glad he ended on that point. It was a point I was going to make too. So I think I'll stop there, but there's a lot to go into. So,
Thank you very much. Professor Wu?
大家好，我是吴华阳，我是美国人。For those of you not fluent in Mandarin, which eventually we all will be, I just said, good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Wu. I'm an American. I'm not a spy. I'm not a spokesperson. But I do aspire to be a bridge builder. The way I opened actually is a little bit of a parlor trick. That's about all the Mandarin I can manage. Whenever I visit China, awestruck, I realize my mother was right. I should have paid attention in Chinese school. So that's a way to frame my comments. As a law professor, I'll make 3 points. Law professors always make 3 points. The first, like our keynote speaker, Congressman Larson, I'm going to challenge the framing here, the very title. The issue isn't whether the United States and China will engage with one another. The issue is on whose terms they will engage. And engagement historically has been thought of from a Western and specifically American perspective, the sense being, perhaps naively, that China would come around, as it opened up, as it interacted, as it adopted more or less a market economy with Chinese characteristics, that those characteristics would fall away and it would join a world order that was liberal, democratic, small d, and that has not come to pass. So let me offer a different sports analogy to think about this, because if you ask me, the challenge now is, will we engage on China's terms, or will we engage on some mutually agreed upon neutral set of terms? So the sports analogy that I would offer is to Linsanity. When Jeremy Lin was a rookie phenomena in basketball, statistically, quantitatively, beyond argument, no other rookie player had achieved in NBA history what he achieved. That is, he performed better than any other rookie ever. Over the past decade, China has performed better than any other nation in recorded history in the following sense. I mean, objectively, materially, measured quantitatively, it's not hyperbole. What I mean is, if you look at the sustained growth over a period of time, the amount of growth, and just the sheer number of people lifted out of poverty, I would challenge you to cite any other example of any other society at any point in time that has had that sustained growth, that amount of absolute growth for such a significant number of people. It just hasn't happened. So this reframes how we understand engagement. The assumption that America would dictate the terms of engagement is not a good assumption. And that's the realization as we enter engagement 2.0, that the terms of engagement will be very different. So that's my first point. It's not will there be engagement, it's who gets to set the rules of the engagement and the recent announcement of tariffs and what might come from the White House. This may be the last moment when America attempts to set the terms of engagement, and whether it is able to prevail is about much more than just steel tariffs. The second point that I would make is we're also witness to a technological transformation and a social media transformation that enables global communities to form, transnational communities that did not exist in the past through, for example, WeChat. So earlier generations of migrants to the United States thought that they were leaving behind their home villages, their families, that they perhaps might not ever see their parents again. When my parents came here to the United States, my mother used to write a letter every day, airmail. Some of you may remember this. You would fold the envelope, you would fold the letter into its own envelope, because we couldn't afford to make an international telephone call. That it was just beyond our means, unless it was to announce that a child had been born or something along those lines. Today, however, for free, you can use WeChat and have a video conversation. And this means if you move from Shanghai to San Francisco, first of all, you can move without being high net worth, and you can travel back and forth readily. But because of technology, you can continue to interact with your boyfriend or girlfriend. You can maintain a relationship, you can share cat videos and so on. This means that, never mind what the government does, there is now organically a sense of community that spans the world that did not before, that creates diaspora identity and that complicates how we perceive of all of this. So it would not, I think, be accurate to say that people fall into just one category. There are people who are effectively transnational, who see their lives, their careers, and their families as shuttling back and forth in a meaningful way without distinction for national boundaries that are set legally or for notions of sovereignty. And this will really alter how we see these dynamics. And I don't just mean with foreign students or with tourists. I mean in a more permanent sense. And this has always been part of how the U.S. and China work together. Was it Mao who said something about exporting Chinese women to the United States when Jimmy Carter complained to Deng Xiaoping about human rights and Chinese not being allowed to leave? Deng Xiaoping's reply to Carter was, well, how many Chinese would you like me to send you? Would 10 million be enough? And so there is now a community that is not defined anymore the way it previously was by notions of sovereignty. Third and finally, I would suggest this is an ongoing process. Part of the mistake that we make is thinking that there will be definitive closure, that there is some way to resolve matters. This is just a constant negotiation, which is why it takes well-meaning people thoughtfully to work on these issues. Because with everything that we look at today, in issues such as North Korea, the world could end any one of a dozen ways tomorrow, right? That's the existential threat we all feel. Social scientists tell us 1 out of 4 children is chronically depressed, right? We live in anxious times such as we've never experienced. And part of what we have to understand about the disruptive economy and everything else is just the sheer volatility that we see in the world beyond U.S. China. U.S. China is just one piece of that, at every moment something could happen, whether it's a single telephone call that disrupts 40 years of a received paradigm, and so on and so forth. So it requires an adaptation and an ability to see that it's now a 30-second news cycle, and if we can't live with that, if we just yearn for a definitive understanding, whatever our view is, whether we're Chinese or American or Chinese American or Chinese diaspora, that moment is not going to come. It's just constant engagement and a constant process. So those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that you've offered a lot of thoughts that will provoke an interesting exchange, but before we turn the floor over to the audience, I'd like to use my prerogative as moderator to bounce a few questions off of each of you. Shanti, you and your colleagues have spent a lot of time tracing Chinese activities, whether we want to call it sharp power, influence operations, whatever term we want to use, Chinese activities to influence discourse in other countries about China. Is there anything that we have watched or witnessed from their activities in other places, whether it's Europe or Australia, that could provide a leading indicator of the direction in which we may see Chinese activities in the United States evolve going forward? And Professor Shambaugh and Professor Wu, you're both at the front lines on universities of an active debate about the role of Confucius Institutes, but you're also key voices in the broader public discussion about Chinese activities in the United States. I would wonder if, between the two of you, if you could maybe offer any thoughts about Confucius Institutes in the United States, but also about public discourse and the way that the media is talking about Chinese operations in the United States. Are there any distinctions about these activities that we should be aware of? But Shanti, why don't we start with you?
Sure. In the context of the Sharp Power report, my colleagues deliberately set out to look at emerging or vulnerable democracies, young democracies. So the parallels there to the U.S. are not so great, but it does speak to some of what, David, I believe you mentioned earlier about, being aware of the context around exchanges and of the context around Chinese media efforts and so on, which I don't disagree with. I think what was striking in those contexts is there is no context. There isn't that depth of local knowledge about China that can objectively assess the impact of these exchanges and media influence. Because China has been so active in investing in some of these younger democracies, that local knowledge of China is not there. They don't have China studies departments. All of the learning about China takes place from the Chinese government framework, and as such, there are certain key elements that are not present in that framework. And so that is not, to try to get your question, that's not so much a leading indicator for the United States, but perhaps more broadly for the rest of the developing world in particular, where China has been very active. That is something that I think should be of concern. For the United States, I read last year, I remember reading a very striking op-ed in the New York Times by Wang Dan, who was one of the Tiananmen activists and later came to seek refuge in the United States. He wrote a compelling piece about how after that he had gone on to get his PhD at Harvard and went to Taiwan to do these salons where he would have these types of open exchanges that I think we're talking about, where you could have a full discussion about China, including the good things and the bad things, including discussion of Tiananmen and things that in Taiwan you would be free to talk about. And he said he would get a lot of students who were visiting students from mainland China to those salons. And there was a great interest in that because that is not part of Chinese history as learned within the PRC. He then thought he would come and take that model to the U.S., and he thought, I'm really excited to bring that to the U.S. because it's been so popular in Taiwan. And he found when he came to the U.S., it was actually quite difficult that people would come to his salons, but the students from mainland China would be very cautious because they were aware that others there might be informing on them, that if they said anything that might be perceived as controversial or against the party line or contravening any red lines back home, they may well, when they went home, get a visit from a public security bureau and or have their families threatened. And so that, to him, he found quite surprising and distressing. And that, I guess, if you're looking for a leading indicator, that's actually happening right now. And that's what I mean by being careful about defending our own values of freedom of speech and expression here at home so that we can protect people who feel vulnerable in those situations. I don't think that it is unfair or unreasonable to expect that on university campuses we should be free to express and examine China in all its complexity without fear of reprisal.
Well, on Confucius Institutes, it's a subject I've followed very closely and have been involved with in my own campus, George Washington University. We have Confucius Institute, and I'm of a different view than Congressman Larson. I see them as quite benign and devoted to their primary mission of teaching language and culture, cultural studies broadly speaking, whether it's film, cooking, taiji, whatever. I thus far don't see evidence that they are being politicized. There have been a couple of cases, there's certainly a lot of publications, a lot of controversy, Marshall Salen's, University of Chicago's articles. There have been a couple of closures, West Florida University most recently. There are some universities, Princeton, for example, that decided, University of Pennsylvania, not to go ahead with a Confucius Institute when they were considering it. But there have been very few closures, and University of South Florida, there was a controversy. But if there are nearly 200 Confucius Institutes in the United States, we've had less than 5 controversies. That tells me one thing. Secondly, there is a lot of, and this sort of goes to the second part of your question, Ryan, about the reporting in the United States. There's a lot of assumptions and innuendo I find in the reporting. One assumption is that a Confucius Institute, and Congressman Larson even evinced this assumption, Confucius Institute somehow affect the curriculum of Chinese studies and the way China is taught on campus. Absolutely wrong. There's a complete firewall between Confucius Institutes that teach language and the rest of the faculty and the curriculum on every university campus, not just at GW, across the country. So they have no impact on how Chinese studies are taught. So that's a flawed assumption that a lot of journalists leap to. And they also tend to take a couple of anecdotal cases and string it together and say, here's a case. So that's a flaw. So I see Confucius Institute so far, we got to watch them very carefully. So I'd say 2 things. We need to have absolute tight oversight, faculty oversight. We have a faculty oversight committee at GW. We meet regularly. We monitor what they do, how they do it. It's like they're under a spotlight by the GW faculty. And every Confucius Institute in the United States ought to be under a spotlight by their faculty. That's called oversight. Second recommendation is transparency. Now, here is a problem. The arrangements, or the contract between recipient universities and the Hanban are kept confidential by request of the Hanban. So when Hanban signs a Confucius Institute with George Washington, they will find a partner university, in our case Nanjing University, and there's an agreement signed. Well, that is kept under lock and key in the president's office of the university. That's not appropriate in American universities. American university faculty senates and faculty and administrators should have open access for oversight purposes. And one element of those contracts is that Confucius Institutes must obey the laws of the People's Republic of China. So that's a problem. So there's a suggestion that we have to make all these CI contracts not publicly available necessarily, but available to the proper oversight authorities on each campus. And then lastly, I fear that there's a kind of momentum in this whole issue of influence operations that the media, the American media, there's a kind of train has left the station, and we have to be very, very, very empirical and very careful in how we assess this issue, not least of which is because of Chinese Americans. And there's a kind of McCarthyite undertone, I sense, that is there. I think we have to be very careful about that. We have to look very carefully at all these operations, whether it's funding to a think tank or a Confucius Institute or some tour for congressmen to China or exchanges with organizations, American NGOs. We have to be very, very empirically careful in how we look at these and not sort of, pull together loose anecdotes and string it together into a narrative.
Thank you, David.
Briefly, the more we engage, the more we study, the better off we are. So I would welcome any means to increase the learning of Chinese language, of Chinese culture. If you just look at how the world will be within our lifetimes, it would be a terrible mistake for us as Americans to fail to take advantage of opportunities to learn about China, however that comes, while always keeping our eyes open. I have a concern that we judge actions very differently. In my classroom, you know what I worry about? I worry about all of my students, not just the ones from mainland China. I worry about my law students not thinking for themselves, not standing up, not speaking out, feeling they have to articulate the prevailing view that their peers find popular. I see that as a universal issue. Now, this may just be a function of age. I'm 51 this year, so now I'm old enough, as my students tell me, to be the age of their parents, right? So I look at wasted youth, right? So I see this as universal, but that's part of the problem. There's no vantage point from which we can assess any of this that's neutral and accepted by all. So there's so many types of conduct that if one person engages in, it's innocuous or praiseworthy, but if someone else engages in, it's suddenly suspicious. Here are two examples. So if you're of Chinese descent and you're an immigrant or maybe even a U.S. citizen and you go visit your ailing parents or grandparents in Beijing, that's going to trigger some concern if you work for the federal government or if you have a role that's at all sensitive. If you're of Irish descent and you visit your ailing parents or grandparents in the home country, that just doesn't attract concern, right? Likewise, if you're a white business person and you go and conduct business in China, well, who wouldn't do that, right? You'd be foolish not to pursue an opportunity. But if you're Chinese American, even if you're a sixth generation Californian, and you want to do business in China, well, that attracts attention that's negative, and it's unwarranted that it's negative. So I worry that there's no vantage point from which we can assess this, and this is true of me as well. We are all biased in some way. So I'll conclude with a simple-minded statement that should not be controversial, but can very quickly lead to controversial normative judgments. Here's the simple-minded statement about China, which is, it is now apparent to all that China does business differently. I mean business in the literal sense of business with SEOs, but also business in the sense of academia, Confucius Institutes. China has a different set of cultural norms. The challenge for us is to ask us as Americans in a nation that's open, that celebrates diversity, and that wants to interact with China. We want the consumers, we want access to the market. What do we do when a nation has sufficient bargaining power and is only increasing in its power, and it says, look, you want to do business with us? Here are the norms for doing business with us. Here's what a map needs to look like. So this is a choice that we have to make. And we can avail ourselves of soft power and our ideals, but that's the bottom line here, that we are now interacting with and wish to interact with a nation that has a set of norms that it is offering to the world as an alternative to American ideals and American leadership.
Thank you. Well, I think that you've provided a lot for people to comment on and react to. If anyone has questions, we'd welcome them now. In the back. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. In the far back. Straight back. Thank you.
My name is Tony Zhao. I'm with the State Legislative Leaders Foundation. Good to see you again, Professor Shambo. I'm one of your former students at the Elliott School. I like very much your analysis of different channels of Chinese influence on the U.S. My question goes on the other direction. How do you think the United States has influenced China in the past 30 or 40 years? And has that influence played a role between U.S. China relationship? For example, I've been influenced by you and by the Elliott School, paying my own tuition. And, I know there are hundreds of thousands of students just like me. And also the fact that every Chinese student has to learn English from the 3rd grade in their elementary school. Do you think there are factors that have influenced, the United States has used to influence China in a governmental way or non-governmental cultural way that might have played a role in the past 30 or 40 years engagement with China? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we take one or two more questions? Right next to you, Jerry.
Hi, I'm Deborah Bradigan from Johns Hopkins University, the China-Africa Research Initiative. And my question is also to David Shambaugh, but it could be to others in the audience. It seems that so much of what we're talking about now we have seen before. And David, you mentioned the McCarthyite echoes of this. And to me, I also see a lot of echoes of Japan's rise and our concerns about Japan as an East Asian power and an economic competitor. China, of course, is bigger than Japan, and that makes it different. China, of course, is communist. Japan was not. But what do you see as the key differences, given that there are all these similarities in these echoes?
Well, Deborah, I think my fellow panelists can also respond to that. Well, key differences have to do with the political system of the People's Republic of China. That's the key difference, and what they permit and don't permit inside their own borders. That's a lot different than Japan, the Japan case. I'm not sure we need to compare China today with some of these other previous times, but we have to remember what did happen in the early 1950s with the McCarthy period. There was a tarnishing. Of course, that was a very strained period. Right after the revolution, we had no diplomatic relations. A lot of things were going on, but there was a tarnishing of our leading China specialists in our government and in our academic community. It devastated those people's lives, the American ability to understand China at a very crucial time, even though we didn't have diplomatic relations. The Korean War was about to break out, and it really fed into, I'm not going to attribute the 2 decades of estrangement that we had between the U.S. and China to the McCarthy movement, but it fed into that. And I'm afraid that we need to invest, the point is we need to invest in China studies now, not sort of go after and tar and tarnish the reputations of China experts. And I sense that hasn't really happened yet in this current period of so-called influence operations, but you can sense an undertone of that, and that concerns me, not just because I'm a China specialist. So I think we have to be very cognizant of that, and we have to be very cognizant of the Chinese-American dimension of this too. Gosh, I don't know. You have to take another course from me to try and address your question about American influence on China. That's a huge debate, and I suppose this is one reason Chung Lee has organized today's session is the Kurt Campbell, Eli Ratner article. Does America need a new China policy? That's why we're all here, right? Well, the argument Campbell and Ratner put forward, I'm not sure I share completely, I do in part, is that the American attempt to change China over the last 4 decades has failed. That's their argument. And we need something new to replace it. But where I don't agree with that is how you measure change. For example, the United States and the outside world have contributed to capacity building and the growth of Chinese institutions, the statistical system, environmental system, legal systems to the extent that has it. So you have to think about change in a more broad context than just the political system. Of course, we would have liked China's political system to be different than it is today. Well, 10 years ago, it was different than it is today, I would argue, under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and Zheng Qinghong. It was a much more open, relatively more open political system than it is today. So it goes back and forth. It's what the Chinese call fang shou, open, close. So, American influence has been substantial. It's going to continue. I think all of you who study in this country, 350,000 this year, go home. You go home with your own experiences, your own memories, and you have to work from within the system to educate your fellow countrymen about the real United States.
Shanti, Frank, would you like to offer anything now? Or?
Gosh, just briefly, I think we have to be pretty careful about throwing around terms like McCarthyism and McCarthyite. I would hate for the need for a more rigorous and careful understanding of the Chinese government's policies to be equated with a very dark time in our history that's also associated with racism and xenophobia. And on that note, I rarely bring my own heritage into things, but as someone who's Chinese American myself, I'm proud of my Chinese heritage and culture, and I want my kids to be as well. As an American, I don't take kindly to my government or other governments telling me how or what to think. And those two things are not contradictory. And I think that needs to be said clearly.
There's a worldwide phenomena that if you're here at Brookings in Washington, D.C., someplace cosmopolitan, if you identify with a hyphenated status such as Asian American or Chinese American, it will shock and alarm that we're seeing in the newspaper headlines every day, and that's the rise of ethnic nationalism, including here in the United States. A form of virulent ethnic nationalism, whether it's in China, the U.S., or Europe, or everywhere, is now resurgent and open, in-your-face ethnic nationalism. And this should concern us regardless of who we are, if we're not ethnic nationalists, which I'm going to guess most people in this room just aren't. And that may ultimately be the divide, not a U.S. China divide, but the ethnic nationalist versus more cosmopolitan divide.
Thank you. Deng Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is also for Professor Schamber. 3 years ago, today, exactly 3 years ago,
I'm
you
not going to
published.
respond to the question. Sorry, I can tell you, I know where you're going. I'm not going to address the question.
No, actually, yeah, I know you published that article and aroused a lot of debate, right? But how would you evaluate today's situation in China?
That's not what this session is about. This is about U.S. China relations today. Next question, please.
Sophie Richardson.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sophie Richardson. I'm Human Rights Watch's China Director. I wanted to ask, first of all, thanks for 3 great presentations. It's lovely to see you all. I actually wanted to ask Professor Wu to elaborate on 2 of the points that you made, which speak to a number of the different discussions that are going on here.
Could you speak up?
Sorry. A couple of questions for you about 2 of the points that you made. One, I am an American. I don't speak basketball, so I don't totally follow that analogy. But you spoke about China's rookie successes. And I guess I'd like to ask you to reconcile the successes that you're talking about with respect, for example, to economics or diplomatic initiatives with a fairly appalling human rights record, up to and including the death in detention last year of Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo. A different kind of question, you spoke very movingly about the importance of transnationalism and the relevance of exchanges. Those are obviously things we support. But I guess I'm interested to hear you talk about your reaction to moves by the Chinese government effectively to divide itself and communities inside China from counterparts outside the country through things like either the foreign NGO management law or even some of the steps that have been made either to restrict the idea of dual nationality or fairly harsh treatment of people who are of ethnic Chinese descent but who aren't PRC citizens. Thanks.
I'll give you a second to collect your thoughts. Maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi, I'm Chen Liu from China Xinhua News Agency, and my question is going to Professor Shen Bao. This could be a follow-up question for you are mentioning about the McCarthy sense just undertone in the media. So my question is that to what extent do you think that this undertone has just been affecting the academia, the universities, and the think tanks in the U.S., and just based on the current situation, do you think that in the future this could be a mainstream or really a rising trend just in the academia? Thank you.
Let's take one more question before.
Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Congressman Larson mentioned the going back to expanding OPEC, Exim Bank, doing things we used to do once upon a time. It seems to me that China, that the system that we had going up to the present moment from about the 1970s has not been as successful as it had been before that. The third world countries for, decades now, we're talking about a new world economic order that never came. The fact that China launched this Belt and Road Initiative has overturned that situation. Now, Africa, Latin America, everybody's looking for development. The issue is, cannot the United States begin to cooperate with that? Congressman Larson said we ought to go on the offensive. I think that's true. We should reestablish OPEC, Exim Bank, and these institutions. But we could do this together with China. The Belt and Road, as the Chinese have said, as President Xi always says, it was initiated by China, but we really don't own it. And we would like other parties to be a part of it. If the United States would say, if President Trump, with his good relationship with President Xi, should say, yes, we'd like to be a part of it. How can we help and what can we do? Wouldn't that have an effect in changing the whole nature of this situation? I think the Chinese would be open to that. And that would actually could become the center of this major power relationship that the Chinese want to accept. But nobody seems to think that. Everybody's viewing the BRI as a Chinese operation, even though they don't see it themselves in that way.
Okay. Do you want to kick us off this time?
Sure. So with respect to the rise of China, I'll answer a question with a question. And it's not a rhetorical question. It's actually a thought experiment. I'm not the first to suggest this. If you are the head of an African nation, looking at President Xi and President Trump side by side, which you could do just a few months ago, and both offer a vision for global leadership and perhaps specifically a material offer to your nation, which one of those individuals would you choose to follow? Especially if they made you some sort of tangible offer, an offer you can't refuse, right? And this is not a rhetorical question. And it's not partisan either. I actually mean to suggest, if we look at these two models, which are now being presented, so we talk about this from either a U.S. or Chinese perspective. Think about the rest of the world. They're watching this, and they're looking at these two alternatives. So that would be my answer to your question about the rise of China. Part of the challenge for anyone who wants to interact with China in any way whatsoever is with issues that you might want to raise, whether they're about human rights, whether they're about anything that China regards as internal. Is there a means, if you want to bridge build, if you want to engage, if you want to obtain a visa, to raise these issues? And I pose this as a question for us collectively. It is difficult to conceive of, and increasingly difficult for those of us who want to effectuate some sort of change, to ask, well, how can we interact meaningfully? I don't have an answer to your question other than to say what China has demonstrated is that it has been able to achieve the material success to the satisfaction of large numbers of its citizens without the accompanying changes that the West assumed would just follow naturally.
Shanti, David, do you have anything you want to offer?
I mean, just to, I guess, follow on that a little bit, I think Much of the past debate on U.S. China relations, just to bring it back to your session today, and certainly in past administrations when human rights were raised, it was in the framework of human rights within China and the extent to which certain administrations felt comfortable pressing this as a key point or wanted to relegate it to the background. For me, what I think has shifted is how comfortable are democracies in raising and protecting key concepts of democracy within their own borders with respect to the conversation with China. To me, that seems not just reasonable, but perhaps fundamental to what democratic governments should be doing. If free speech is in fact a cornerstone of democracy, as I think many would agree, then it is incumbent upon all of us in a democratic society, and particularly at the governmental level, to defend that key cornerstone. And that should not be controversial. That is a reframing of the U.S. China relationship, or in fact all democracies that are engaging with China, and that it becomes less about what you are advocating for within China, although that is certainly part of what should be raised, but also what are you prepared to defend as your key interests at home. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to raise in the context of bilateral talks or a relationship. And in fact, I would be surprised if the Chinese government didn't expect it to be raised in that context.
Well, I hesitated to use the term McCarthy, and I maybe shouldn't have. And maybe another term like witch hunt is, perhaps better, because it does have a lot of very negative connotations, and we had a very difficult period in our country's history as a result of that, which we don't want to repeat. But I'm just trying to say that I think there are these undertones, Deborah and others, that I sense in the American media about this, and I'm just trying to caution that this has a kind of momentum of its own, and we need to stop that train in the tracks immediately, not go there, and investigate, as I've said, and I think Shanxi would agree, this phenomenon of Chinese activities in the United States very carefully, very empirically, very systematically, and let it lead where it leads. In some areas we will find some things that are discomforting. Other areas we may find that there's nothing discomforting. But this is early days and we need to do this systematically. I'm part of a project, in fact, that is trying to do this. What I worry about is free speech. And the ability for all of us to speak freely in our own societies without any retribution. Congressman Larson spoke about this, but there's a variety of potential retribution from China for things that Americans or other foreigners say or write. Now, you just asked me a question about an article I published 2 years ago. I'll tell you, there has been consequences. I have been punished by the Chinese government and your articles as a result because of that. So I have paid a personal and professional price in the last 3 years for my free speech, my professional opinion on where China was at that point in time. Is that appropriate? I don't think so. We have free speech in this society. I'm just using my case as one instance. There are institutions, University of Maryland, University of California, San Diego, Emory University, have been institutionally punished by China for actions they have taken. So my point is that there's a kind of fine line. We don't want to self-censor. American China specialists and certainly should not self-censor themselves and should be reminding themselves every morning when they wake up to call it as they see it without fear of retribution from the Chinese state. But there is retribution from the Chinese state, and that is a real problem.
Thank you. We have time for one more round of questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm Huanxin Zhao from China Daily USA. I'd like you to comment on the latest U.S. survey on China's U.S. image conducted by Pew. The results was released on February 28th. It says that 53% of the U.S. Public views China favorably or most favorably. This compares with the 50% of the favorable opinion on China. and this percentage, 53%, is the highest in the past 30 years. But given the rhetoric, the Trump administration's rhetoric about China, this trade frictions between these two countries, how do you think about this? How do you comment on this finding by the Pew polling agency? Thank you.
Thank you. And right here.
Hello, my name is Susanna Vesela. I'm from the Czech Republic. I would like to ask, you all talked about the need for more studies of China in the US, but you also mentioned the fact that the academic access is being significantly decreased over time in China. So what can the US do? What leverage does the US have to increase the openness of the Chinese government, and what trends do you predict for the future? Thank you very much.
Okay. And the final question will be back here.
Hi, Paul Huang, reporter for the Epoch Times. Question for Professor Shenbo. So you mentioned that you don't believe that China is doing what it is doing to, what you don't believe that China is doing to the United States and what it is currently doing to Australia. Now, I wonder if you could elaborate it a little bit, what exactly China is doing to Australia that differentiates what it is not doing in the United States. And since Australia is a treaty ally of the United States, should we consider it acceptable what China is currently doing to Australia? Thank you.
Okay, so this time I suggest that maybe we start with Shanti and then Professor Shanba, Professor Wu, and then after that we'll give you guys a chance for any parting thoughts you would like to offer.
Actually, don't start with me. I'm still
Okay,
forming.
then we'll start this way and head that way.
Just very briefly on all of this, the way we tend to frame these issues confuses two questions. One question is, what is actually happening? The other question is, what do we think of what's actually happening? And so we get the factual inquiry mixed up with the normative judgment, and that just makes it difficult for us to figure this out. And it's not black and white. So the sentiment out there beyond the Beltway is very different than on Capitol Hill, right? What is it that mayors and governors want? They want Chinese students, they want Chinese tourists, they want Chinese investment, they want a Chinese company to come and rescue the steel mill that's in town that might otherwise close, right? So you can simultaneously have incredibly harsh, the most negative rhetoric emanating from Capitol Hill that does not match with the sentiment of the average person on the street or of politicians who are seeking investment. So that there's no contradiction. That's just the way America is. You can have these multiple viewpoints, glass half full, glass half empty.
Okay, well, on the Australia case, it's a big, complicated subject we don't have time really to go into, but if you're not familiar with the Australia case, I would suggest you read the parliamentary report, the Australian parliamentary report on it, and a new book that has just finally been published called Silent Invasion in Australia. It details both of those. I haven't read the full book yet, but the parliamentary report is extremely detailed. And it's resulted in a lot of new legislation in Australia to try and prevent some of the things that had been occurring. For example, Chinese funding of Australian politicians. For some reason, Australia had no law about foreign funding for their politicians. Well, they're now, they've discovered that that's a problem. And they are now enacting such legislation and a number of other areas. So, so there's that. There's been censorship on campuses. There's been criticism of professors in the classroom. There's been video recording of professors giving lectures in Australian classrooms that's then uploaded onto the internet and goes viral in China. And then that professor gets bombarded with spam and other phishing and email attacks from China. A lot of issues in the academic world. Anyway, the parliamentary report is the place to go to educate yourself on what's been happening in Australia. And if you run through that long list of things that the Chinese have been doing in Australia, and then you say, is that happening here in America? I conclude, no, at least not yet. And then you should read the Merrick's report on Europe, similar, very detailed. So I don't see that happening here. Speaking of Europe, young lady from the Czech Republic, really interesting question. What can the United States do to improve the academic reciprocity, you might call it, with China? I wish I had an answer. It's like many other areas. What can the U.S. do? The temptation is tit for tat. Do to them what they're doing to us. Close our classrooms, close our research institutes, close our libraries, close our archives. Just have a cutout. No Chinese allowed in the National Archives in Suitland, Maryland. No, we can't go there. That's not the United States. We're a free and open society. That is our strength. We should never be tempted to compromise our free and open society's principles and values to retaliate against a society that's not free and open. So there's a strong temptation to do that in the trade sphere, in the academic sphere, and other spheres. I think we've just got to talk, this is a government issue. The highest levels of the U.S. government have got to be raising this. We have a memorandum of understanding of educational cooperation between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It's quite detailed. It's been renewed 3 times, I think, since 1979. Well, we should go through that, with the Chinese government point by point and look for areas where the Chinese side is not reciprocal. And call them out on it. And the public and the academics have a role to play here too, to expose lack of reciprocity. There's one academic at the Hoover Institution who's a historian, and he's recently found some very disturbing evidence, he was with you, that the Chinese are redacting publications, online publications, journals, in his case, legal journals. They're rewriting history, quite literally. So if a foreign scholar wants to access a legal journal from 1957 in the anti-rightist campaign, it's in the hard copy, maybe at the Library of Congress, but if you go online through the CKNI index, gone. This is really concerning. So I don't know. I think my point is that the media, the academic world can speak with its own voice to call out China on its restrictions, and the U.S. government has to call out China on these academic restrictions, just as important as CFIUS or any of these other problem areas in the U.S.-China relationship. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you very much, David. We're near the end of our time. I wanted to give you all a last chance if there are any parting thoughts that you'd like to offer before we exit stage.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly say I think David's point just now about the role of civil society and the academic sector in themselves standing up for academic freedom or for certain values is critical. And I think you're starting to see that now, for instance, with Cambridge University Press, when they made this quiet agreement to censor their publication. It was actually the outcry from civil society and from academics who said, no, this is not acceptable to us. And there have been calls among academics to say, we will not peer review, for instance, for a journal that agrees to do this. So there are ways that civil society can itself try to mobilize around these issues. But I do agree, and I would say that I think the response should never be to shut down open societies as a response to closed societies. That's obviously not an alternative. This goes back to my original point about democracies having to identify what their core values are and to stand by them in these interactions. One thing that I think we found in studying not just China but other authoritarian countries is that how they manage and react to public opinion and civil society and independent media and independent expression at home is a good indicator of that approach abroad. Now, it's not always, but it is a good indicator, and because it's an expression of the core values of the governing system. And so when that governing system takes that approach overseas into democracies, that's where you start to see the constriction of free expression as a result. And there's no reason why democracies should simply accept this type of relationship as the way that it ought to be. if democracies are concerned about their core values and believe that those fundamental tenets of democratic expression are worth standing up for, then that should be part of the conversation. I think what we're in the middle of examining now is understanding how it's not been part of the conversation to date, really, and trying to shed a little bit more light on that. And in those efforts, I hope that we will continue to be fair and to examine things carefully and with attention to detail, and to not generalize, but to do so, as David has said, without fear of retribution, because that fear of retribution will curtail and shut down all forms of that kind of study to begin with.
Thank you.
Much of the harshest criticism of China reflects anxiety about America. What I mean by that is I take the keynote to say we have to get our own house in order. I agree we have core values that we must articulate and defend and advance, but part of the problem is our own core values in America are threatened in America, never mind from China. So that in part is the issue. I make very few ideological statements, but I'll say something as an absolute. Engagement is almost always better than disengagement, non-engagement, and isolation. So the more that we can promote engagement, the better. What we've now realized is engagement is, in the American vernacular, a two-way street, and that's what we didn't realize before.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think this issue, as we move into this issue of Chinese so-called influence activities in the U.S., and we're in the early stages of this. The National Endowment did a really good report. I'm involved in another project that's working on one. I'm aware of two others. So this is going to go on for a while. We just need to be, just to reemphasize the point, ruthlessly empirical about how we go about researching and analyzing this phenomenon, because it is a phenomenon. It's not fake news, ladies and gentlemen. Now, that's the first point. Second point is to be aware that exchanges, I agree with Frank, we need them. All countries need them. And the U.S. and China really need them at this point in time. But exchanges are about influence. That's, as I said in my opening remarks. But it's up to the potential target of the influence to be influenced or not to be influenced. We have to have our intellectual integrity. We go into a meeting with Chinese, we walk out of the meeting with Chinese. Has our thinking changed? Perhaps, but it's up to that individual to come to their own conclusions. But the last point is the one I guess I started on. This is all about China's desire to control the international narrative about their country. In fact, I didn't mention it at the beginning. They have the term Huayu Jian, discourse war. This is a term that's used repeatedly in the Chinese media and propaganda documents from 2007 onwards. They believe they're in a discourse war with the West, which has a discourse hegemony, Huayu Baquan, over the description of China. They think all the Western media have so biased the international community's understanding of China that they're going into a war. They don't use the word John accidentally. This is not a contest or a sporting match. It's a John. So they have thrown billions of dollars into this effort. And we just have to be conscious of what it is they're trying to do. They're trying to affect the narrative in lots of different ways. But we, too, we have our own independent judgment. We should constantly analyze and describe China publicly in our academic writings as we see it, and not be fearful of retribution. But ladies and gentlemen, Chinese state's retribution is real. And that's a price that everybody has to consider when they say something.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking this expert panel on advancing a discussion about a very complex and sensitive issue.